The skillet was still hot when they found her. A blackened stew pot, a kitchen half lit by kerosene flame, and the scent of something metallic, burnt sugar, iron, or maybe flesh. The fire in Naomi Walker's kitchen, that July night of 1919, should have been a small thing, the sort of accident country people forgot by morning. But the next day, Sheriff Leland's report mentioned something strange. The supper was charred beyond recognition, yet Naomi's skin bore no external burn, only a pale mark across her collarbone shaped like a hand. Neighbors said the clock stopped at 7:03 p.m. The local paper buried the story under domestic mishaps. But 50 years later, a box of photographs surfaced from the Walker property. One image showing Naomi before the fire, smiling, holding a wooden spoon, and behind her, a figure no one could identify. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments, because this isn't just a story, it's a truth history forgot. The first thing anyone remembered was the smell, thick, earthy, something between rain-soaked iron and boiled ham. It hung low in the great house kitchen that night, pressing against the walls as if the air itself had weight. Steam rose from the cast-iron pot, hesitated mid-air, then folded back down, like breath retreating from a cold mirror. It was July 3rd, 1919, a Thursday evening just before supper. The sky outside was a pale bruise of heat and haze. Cicadas screamed from the trees beyond the veranda. But inside the kitchen there was only the hum of something unsteady, something that didn't belong. Naomi Walker stood by the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stirring a pot of ham and beans that refused to soften. She was deliberate in motion, with a patience learned through years of other people's kitchens. The great houses were a wealthy family in Tuscaloosa County, cotton money, rail money. Their kitchen was newer than most, tiled and proper, with a black iron range that burned coal instead of wood. But that evening, every match Naomi struck burned, weak, and died before she could set the kindling right. She tried again. Another match. Another small hiss. "The air feels different," she had written in her small ledger earlier that morning, her neat handwriting pressed between notes on grocery weights and spice orders. Even the matches burned strange. Outside, the summer air carried the scent of magnolia and stormwater. Alabama was uneasy that year, half in recovery, half in waiting. The Great War was over, but men still limped through town on canes that clacked against red clay streets. The influenza had taken half the church choir that spring, and in the northern papers, headlines whispered of riots. Red Summer, they called it. Naomi read about fires, about men dragged from trains. She folded the paper carefully and never mentioned it to anyone. By late afternoon, the house was quiet. The great houses were away in town, except for Will, their eldest son, 19, pale and polite, who often wandered into the kitchen looking for conversation more than food. He found Naomi standing before a pot that steamed without boiling, her brow furrowed, her hands still. He remembered the sound first, like a kettle screaming, he would say later in his statement. Not the shrill of metal on heat, but a human kind of sound, thin, continuous, full of strain. When he entered, the stove was glowing, not with fire, but with light, a dull orange pulse that lived somewhere under the iron. The coal bed was cold, untouched. Naomi didn't turn to look at him. Her eyes stayed on the window, where the last of the daylight glinted against the glass like a fading signal. "It's cooking itself," she whispered. The words hung in the heat, suspended, half disbelief, half prayer. What followed became the kind of story small towns refused to agree on. Some said she screamed, others said she just stepped back and went still as the walls began to tremble. One neighbor swore she saw smoke pour from the kitchen window, but the curtains never caught. When the coroner, Dr. Abel Ross, arrived 2 hours later, the house was heavy with the stench of metal and beans. Naomi was found beside the stove, her apron untouched, her skin unburned. The pot was sealed shut with something that looked like glass, smooth and hard as cooled lava. Ross's report listed the cause as internal combustion trauma. No further detail. The body bore no scorch, no wound, but something within had ruptured. He made a note in the margin, one line, written in haste before the page bled from humidity. Ask about the hymn she was humming. 4 years after. People in Tuscaloosa whispered that the hymn was there as a fountain filled with blood, a song Naomi's mother had loved. Others said it was Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. No one could agree on that either. The Greathouse family moved away the following spring. The kitchen was sealed, the stove sold for scrap. No one could get it to light again. The ledger Naomi kept vanished into the estate auction, but one page turned up decades later, its ink pale and trembling. The last entry, written the morning of her death, read, "Air feels thick today. The wind won't move, right?" In 1921, the courthouse fire took a small section of records the coroner's archive among them. No one ever found Dr. Ross's full report, but a surviving index listed her case number, 1919-47A. Next to it, in pencil, a faint note, "See missing file. Probable anomaly." When an archivist from Montgomery reviewed the remaining documents in 1953, she described the handwriting as careful, almost fearful, like a man who wanted to be exact but not responsible. She underlined one phrase that had survived the smoke damage: combustion without ignition. Then she wrote in the margin, almost as an afterthought, "What could burn inside a person without touching skin?" Back in Tuscaloosa, old residents told the story differently. They said the summer of 19 had been wrong from the start. That cows refused to feed for 3 nights in a row. That clocks stopped at 7:15, only to start again when the rain fell. That the wind, for a week straight, moved only east. There was one surviving photograph of Naomi Walker, taken the year before, in 1918, for the church bulletin. She stands outside, hands folded, eyes half in sunlight. Nothing unusual except the faint blur near her shoulder. A streak of brightness the local historian later called a camera fault. But under magnification, the blur isn't light. It's heat distortion, the kind that ripples above flame. For decades, the story was told as superstition, a cook's misfortune, a faulty stove, an overactive imagination. Yet every retelling circled back to the same question: why did the fire die every time she stirred? In her last hours, neighbors recalled hearing her hum through the open window. The melody drifted with the sound of cicadas, soft and steady, like someone coaxing calm from the air. Then the humming stopped. A flash lit the window pane. The pot rattled once and went still. There's something strange about silence after heat. It doesn't cool, it waits. Years later, when the old Greathouse property was sold and the foundation dug up, workers found a patch of earth where the kitchen had been. The soil there was fused solid, not blackened but pale, as if the minerals themselves had melted and reformed. The foreman described it as a ghost of glass. They buried it back under new concrete. The story never left Tuscaloosa. Old men and diners still talk about the supper that wouldn't cook, how the air refused to lift the steam. In the county library, a yellowed clipping still carries her name, but what lingers most isn't the mystery of the stove or the missing report. It's that note, the coroner's faint reminder, almost a plea. Ask about the hymn she was humming. Some say the hymn itself carried something of vibration, a resonance that the air couldn't bear. Others say she was simply tired, caught between grief and heat, between one world ending and another too cruel to begin. Still, when the Alabama nights grow thick with humidity and the air presses heavy enough to still a flame, people remember. They hum softly without knowing why, and somewhere, in the back of their minds, they see the image, steam rising, folding back, as if the air itself refused to lift it. That's how the story of Naomi Walker begins, not with a death, but with a supper that would never cook, And in that collapsing breath of steam lies a question that history never answered. What happens when the world decides, just for a moment, to turn its fire inward? Dust drifts through the air like something sacred. The old church creaks in the heat, the light falling through stained glass fractured and trembling. Rows of empty pews leaned with the weight of time, their varnish long surrendered to dust. Somewhere, near the altar, a single voice hums. It has no words, only a slow, human vibration sobbed at first, then deeper, echoing through the wooden ribs of the church like breath through an instrument. Locals say Naomi Walker always hummed while she worked. It was her way of keeping rhythm in silence, of making long days bearable. The tune wasn't remarkable, just an old camp meeting him. Lay your burden down, something passed from field to firelight across generations. But those who remembered, the night she died, said the melody changed. It slowed to half its usual pace, stretching every note like a body underweight. At exactly 7:03 p.m., every clock in the great house home froze. For a long time, people called it coincidence, power, surges, clockwork failure, tricks of heat. But there's something unsettling about the precision of stopped time. Every pendulum, every winding spring, every tick stilled in the same breath. Months later, Reverend Seal Duggan, a local preacher, wrote in his 1920 sermon ledger, "A woman called Naomi burned without burning. She sang a song that bent time." The handwriting was small and deliberate, as though even he wasn't sure what he'd seen or what he wanted history to believe. No one remembered Dugan much after that. His congregation scattered, his name faded from church records. But 50 years later, his ledger resurfaced. In 1974, a team of graduate researchers from the University of Alabama began an oral history project on early 20th century spiritual practices in the South. They found Duggan's notebook buried among estate papers donated by his granddaughter. Its pages were warped from humidity, its ink half-eaten by silverfish. But the words remained. One entry, circled twice, read, "The song that slowed the hands of the clock. The air swayed though no wind pass. The Lord's hour stretched itself to listen. What drew the researchers wasn't faith, it was pattern." They traced the hymn's origins backward, through fragments of sheet music and oral testimony, until they reached the Gula coastlands of South Carolina and Georgia. There, the song "Lay Your Burden Down" carried another name once, burden. Oh, the body. It had been sung during Reconstruction, in hush harbors and praise houses, then quietly banned by white preachers who claimed it stirred unclean spirits. The melody, simple and haunting, was said to invite those who'd passed to draw near to walk, if only for a moment, beside the living. It wasn't a hymn for mourning. It was a door. Dr. Fiona Mott, a linguist, an ethnomusicologist who joined the study in 1976, noted something peculiar about the phrase, "burden down, Lord." In certain dialects, especially in the coastal Creoles, the words held a double meaning: to lay sorrow aside and to let go of flesh. It was a release song, she wrote. A negotiation between the spirit and the body. In Naomi's case, that negotiation may have become something else. When the researchers played a surviving field recording of the hymn, captured on a reel-to-reel in 1949, a strange interference threaded through the playback. The hum was low, almost subsonic, but it distorted the magnetic tape as though the sound itself carried weight. Every time the words "burdened down" were sung, the recording wavered, the pitch sagging, like time itself slipping beneath the surface. The archivist in charge of preservation marked it as audio instability, but one graduate assistant and intern named Paul Reeves recorded his own notes that day. His memo survives. The frequency drop isn't random. It's exact 7.03 hertz. No one connected it then. Not the clocks. Not the time of Naomi's death. When Reverend Dugan had written his line, a woman who sang a song that bent time, he wasn't being poetic. He was being literal. The great house home, the kitchen, the stopped clocks, these weren't just accidents of folklore. They were signals, perhaps, of a world trying to synchronize with something it wasn't meant to. One of the oral accounts from the 1974 study mentioned an elderly woman named Miss Alberta Shaw, who claimed to have worked alongside Naomi briefly. In 1918, she described her as quiet but sure of the spirit. When asked about the hymn, Shaw paused for nearly a minute before answering. "That wasn't no kitchen song," she said softly. "That was a calling song. You sing it when you're ready to see someone again, when you got something unfinished. If that's true, then Naomi wasn't humming to pass time. She was summoning it to hold, to return, to open." The researchers published fragments of their findings in a 1977 journal under the title Temporal Anomalies in African American Spiritual Music. It was dismissed as speculative, even absurd. The university distanced itself quietly. By 1980, the project's reels and notes were boxed, labeled folk materials, and shelved in the archives. But Dr. Mott never stopped investigating. In her private field notes, she wrote about returning to Tuscaloosa, visiting the remains of the Great House property, now nothing more than a cement slab overrun with weeds. She stood where the kitchen had once been, humming the first lines of "Lay Your Burden Down" under her breath. When she reached the chorus, her wristwatch, an old wind-up, vast up. The second hand froze at 7 minutes past 3. It restarted only when she stepped away. She wrote, "There is a pressure in the air here, a density, like the world holding its breath." Even decades later, the local community held traces of Naomi's story. Some said her song could still be heard on hot evenings if you stood by the sycamore grove near the old property line. Others said you'd know it was near when the crickets went quiet all at once. There's an unease in how the past echoes the way a voice can travel through time. Not as sound, but as memory embedded in air. A recently discovered recording from the same 1974 project captured an interview with an unnamed male speaker, believed to be one of the Great House family's farmhands. His statement is fragmented, but one line is clear. She sang like she was answering somebody, like someone far off was calling back. The audio ends abruptly after that mid-sentence. In 2003, a sound engineer named Michael Leary did those reels for preservation. When he cleaned the noise from the file, he noticed faint background tones just below human hearing. The pattern repeated at exactly 7 seconds and 3 milliseconds apart. He later wrote, "It's as if the silence itself was keeping time." The hymn wasn't just melody, it was mechanism. And perhaps that's what Reverend Dugan meant when he wrote about a song that bent time. It wasn't metaphor, but a record of a moment when faith, grief, and physics overlapped long enough for something impossible to occur. Naomi's ledger, found years after her death, held no direct mention of the hymn, but one cryptic note near the end. "Don't stir after the last verse." It's the kind of sentence that seems meaningless until you remember the night she died, standing by that pot, stirring until the flame itself refused to burn. Dr. Mott, before her passing in 1998, gave a lecture on spiritual resonance and what she called linguistic hauntings. The idea that certain phrases, repeated across generations, accumulate energy the way stones accumulate heat. Words as carriers. Songs as thresholds. She mentioned Naomi by name. In the lecture transcript, her closing statement reads, "To lay your burden down is to release the body. But to call someone home, that's an act of defiance against separation itself." Defiance. That's what Naomi's final song might have been. Not surrender, not farewell. A call steady, reaching, patient as light through dust. And if that call reached across something unseen, something beyond time, then perhaps the frozen clocks were not the sign of an ending, but of an answer. For a moment, time listened, somewhere. Between 7:02 and 7:04, the world held still long enough for one voice to be heard by another. That's why the air trembled. That's why the hymn slowed. She wasn't singing to let go. She was calling someone home. And what she summoned has never truly left. The first thing you notice is the smell of something dry, ancient, faintly sweet, like paper that once met fire but refused to surrender. The ledger lies open beneath a shaft of afternoon light, its edges curled and darkened, the ink bleeding outward as though it had been breathed on, not soaked. The handwriting remains steady. Deliberate, each loop and stroke preserved through heat and decades of silence. It was found in 1946, 27 years after the night Naomi Walker's supper refused to cook. Her niece, Esther, had come down from Birmingham to claim what was left of the great house property, a charred foundation and a crumbling chimney swallowed by vines. She was 26, war widow, hair tied back with a handkerchief still smelling faintly of factory soap. The house was quiet except for the occasional drop of water falling from the ceiling, echoing against scorched tile. Under the kitchen's loose floorboard, half rotted, half sealed by soot, she found the book. A small black ledger, bound in cracked leather, its clasp rusted shut. The first pages were harmless. Recipes, mostly. Corn pudding, molasses cake, a stew labeled simply for company. Measurements written in Naomi's careful, looping hand. The ink trembled only on one page, as though written in haste. Then, near the middle, the recipes stopped. A list began. Names, dates, no explanations. At first, Esther thought they were notes for grocery delivery suppliers, perhaps, but something in the spacing felt deliberate, a kind of rhythm, each line written as though part of a pattern. When she looked closer, she recognized a few of the surnames people she'd heard her mother mention, women who'd worked in kitchens across the county during the summer of 1919. She took the ledger to the courthouse, hoping to match the handwriting to property records. Instead, she found obituaries. Half the names from Naomi's list appeared in the Tuscaloosa Gazette that same July. Each obituary read differently, but the cause of death echoed: kitchen fire, stove, explosion, tragic, domestic. Accident. One woman died boiling preserves, another while lighting her range, a third, just 15, while tending biscuits, before dawn. 12 women, all within 30 days. No connection drawn. No inquest filed. The town's explanation was simple. Faulty stoves. Modern fuel, they said, still new to country homes. But Esther's unease grew when she noticed the handwriting in the margins faint, nearly erased. Beside the final name, Naomi had written one word. Light. Esther closed the book and kept it wrapped in linen for the rest of her life. She never spoke of it again. Decades later, In 1983, a historian named Lillian Price came across the ledger while compiling research for the Southern Domestic Studies Journal. She described it as a ghost document, half domestic, half prophetic. In her published essay, she suggested a pattern of industrial stove defects, perhaps tied to a faulty batch distributed that summer, but in her personal notes, never intended. For print, she wrote a different question. What kind of defect burns from the inside out? Price had access to coroner reports from across the county. The official files listed superficial burns, inconsistent with fatal heat exposure. One deputy described a heat rising under the skin, though the phrasing was struck out before the document was archived. For weeks, Price studied Naomi's ledger by microfilm, zooming in on every line. The ink appeared disturbed by more. Then water damage it rippled, as if the page itself had shrunk away from what was written. She sent it to a preservation lab in Montgomery, where technicians performed an ultraviolet scan. Under light, faint grease patterns emerged, they thought, until they realized the scale was wrong. The marks coiled outward, forming a spiral across the page, too large, too precise for any human hand. At the spiral's center, beneath the faded entries, one word appeared 3 times. Remember, remember, remember. Price's assistant documented. The finding, noting the word was written in a thicker ink, applied later, possibly years after the rest of the entries. The strokes trembled, not rushed, but deliberate, like someone trying to make the word hold against forgetting. The mystery deepened when they discovered microscopic traces of ash embedded within the grease spiral, organic carbon, but from no identifiable source. Not coal, not wood, something denser. When Price later examined Naomi's handwriting samples from her recipes and grocery lists, she noticed subtle differences in the ledger's later pages. The spacing grew uneven, as if Naomi were copying from something unseen, her hand guided more by rhythm than thought. She proposed the theory that Naomi had been recording a ritual of sorts, passed quietly through working women, hidden within. The language of domestic life, a code written in ordinary tasks. Boil, stir, wait, each motion like a verse in a song too old to name. But what kind of song ends with fire? In one of Price's last recorded lectures before her death, she read from Naomi's ledger aloud to her students. As she spoke, she described feeling a vibration beneath her hand, the hum of something almost electrical. A student later wrote in her notes. Her voice changed at the word remember. Like the room tightened around it. There are still people in Tuscaloosa who recall that lecture. The overhead lights flickered once. A fluorescent buzz deepened. And then silence. Price died a year later. Her archive boxes labeled Walker case were donated to the university but catalogued incorrectly. When rediscovered in 2009, many of the pages were missing, the ultraviolet photographs included. Only one index card survived, bearing her final annotation. The spiral reads like movement, not pattern. A turn inward, not out. Today, the ledger sits in a climate-controlled vault, the paper too fragile to touch. Digital scans reveal more than the eye can, faint impressions, indentations left by a pen pressing through several layers. If enhanced, those marks form incomplete words that repeat in sequence. Heat, circle, keep, name. It's unclear whether Naomi wrote them consciously, or if the paper absorbed something from the act of her final hours. One forensic conservator described the document as alive with residue. Her report reads, the fibers respond to temperature almost imperceptibly. They tighten when warmed, loosen when cooled. Like breath. A pattern, again. A pulse in paper. Maybe that's what Esther felt when she first opened it in 1946, the faint warmth still clinging to the page after nearly 3 decades sealed. Beneath wood. Maybe. Naomi's words never cooled. There's a photograph of the ledger taken under raking light. The burned edges glow faintly orange, like the last line of sunset across a dark field. Near the bottom margin, where the spiral fades, the ink pulls into one final loop and readable, blurred, but echoing the motion of a fingerprint too large to belong to one person. Historians disagree about what the spiral means. Some say it's accidental, the mark of oil spilled and drawn outward by capillary motion. Others argue it was deliberate, a symbol used in older Gullah cosmology to represent the pathway between worlds, the turning of life into death and back again. In that sense, Naomi's ledger might not have been a recipe book at all. It may have been a map. If so, then those names, those 12 entries from 1919, were not just memorials. They were coordinates. Women bound by rhythm and repetition, their work unrecorded except in kitchens and hymnals, their deaths dismissed as coincidence, their stories erased by fire. Naomi had written them down not to explain, but to preserve. Each name, each date, an act of resistance against forgetting. And the spiral, closing inward, was the motion of return, a call to memory. To witness. That's what remember meant. Not nostalgia. Not prayer. Instruction. The Ledger of Ash was a book that refused to die, holding within it the pattern of something larger than one life, one death, or one strange supper that would not cook. Even now, under controlled light, when we open its digital scan, the page edges darken ever so slightly like an ember, recalling its flame. Maybe it's nothing, a quirk of exposure, a trick of pixels. Or maybe, as Naomi wrote it, the act of remembering still carries heat. And somewhere, beneath layers of ash and silence, her final word continues to hum, quiet, steady, unending. Remember? A faint hiss fills the tape before the boy's voice begins. Fragile, trembling, the sound of time trying to remember itself. I don't know if it was fire, he says, but it moved like one. The reel crackles, stops, starts again. His words dragged like something pulled from a deep well. The recording is dated February 3rd, 1979, 59 years after the Greathouse fire. William Greathouse Jr. had been 12 that night. When the flames came, he was the only one who saw Naomi clearly. The others remembered chaos, smoke, shouting. But he remembered silence. She looked at the fire like it was her own child, he whispers, as if ashamed to say it aloud. The interviewer, unseen, shifts in her chair. The microphone hums with static. Then the boy now, an old man, adds, and the child looked back. The archivist's notes describe the recording as uneasy listening. Every pause sounds deliberate, too long. Every word carries weight like confession. William's voice has that brittle southern Curtis's low vowels softened by guilt. Yet behind it, something quivers. She wasn't afraid, he says. Not once. Like she'd been waiting for it. Records show the interview took place in a county nursing home. The walls were pale green, the air heavy with antiseptic. William had requested no visitors. He hadn't spoken of that night in 60 years. But when the interviewer psychologist, Dr. Renee Porter, asked, "Why now?" he replied, "Because she's been quiet too long." Porter's report later called his phrasing dissociative. But her notes, found in a separate folder, contain one handwritten question. Quiet, where? Through the tape, faint mechanical ticks betray the reel's age. Porter's voice appears occasionally, steady, but careful. "William," she asks, "what happened after you saw the flames?" He exhales sharply. Nothing happened after. Everything happened before. Then, softly, the old man laughs a dry, paper-thin sound. He begins to describe how Naomi's hands glowed like candles trapped under skin, how the curtains never burned, though the air shimmered with heat, how every clock in the house, 3 of them, stopped at the same instant, 7:03, the same time recorded decades earlier in Reverend Duggan's ledger. Was she in pain? Porter asks. No, he answers. She smiled, like she was done hiding. The phrase recurs 3 times throughout the recording, each repetition fainter, as though distance itself is erasing him. Analysts reviewing the tape in 1982 noted irregularities in his heart monitor. His pulse stayed steady until the moment he described Naomi's smile, then spiked to 134 beats per minute. Some suggest stress, others suggest recognition. Porter's later psychological analysis argued that Williams' description fit the pattern of a dissociative recall episode, but her language slips. His tone, she writes, suggests not terror but reverence. She concludes her notes with an observation rarely seen in clinical writing. The subject's fear appears directed not toward what he witnessed, but toward forgetting it. Fragments of the interview survive beyond the official transcript. One reel contains ambient noise, the soft scrape of chair legs, the faint clink of jewelry. Porter's voice fades in mid-sentence, and for several seconds, all that remains is breathing. 2 sets, in rhythm, in sync. Then one voice speaks, hardly audible. She didn't burn. She left. The flame was just what she left behind. The line is followed by a silence that feels intentional, as if the machine itself paused to listen. The reel ends abruptly with a snap of magnetic tape. For years, archivists assumed that was all. Until, in 2003, a sound engineer restoring the tape for digital preservation noticed something underneath Williams' last words. A faint, melodic hum. Nearly imperceptible, yet perfectly in key, with the hymn of 7:03, the same wordless tune Naomi was known to hum while working. The discovery reignited old debates within the university's folklore department. Some claimed the hum was mechanical resonance. Others heard deliberate pitch structure when the waveform was isolated. The pattern revealed 5 sustained notes identical to the opening of Lay Your Burden Down. The engineer's report mentions a second harmonic presence, implying another voice overlapping Williams' own frequency. He described it as a female tone, tonal but without breath. The phrasing drew criticism from peers, but the description stayed in the file. In later years, skeptics tried to rationalize it. Faulty recording equipment, electromagnetic bleed from nearby transformers. But the nursing home had no such transformers in 1979, and the hum's consistency across 3 tapes defied technical explanation. Williams' nephew, who listened to the restored version decades later, said it felt like someone singing from inside the tape itself. He wept during playback. When asked why, he said the sound didn't feel like memory, it felt like invitation. Researchers revisiting the transcript note how often Williams' language returns to themes of release. She was done hiding. She left. She looked back. Every line reads like farewell. Yet his final moments on tape suggest something else, an active return. Porter's assistant recalled that after the interview ended, William remained still, eyes open, breathing shallow. He seemed to listen to something neither of them could hear. After several minutes, he whispered, "It's quieter now," and asked for the recorder to be turned off. He died the following year, leaving behind no other accounts. No written recollections, only that 8-minute tape. The archivists who handle it today do so with gloves. The label is fading, written in pencil. Testimony of the boy. Each playback begins with the same crackle, the same momentary distortion before the boy's voice emerges again, timeless, suspended. His words, once uncertain, now carry the weight of final testimony. She didn't burn. She left. and beneath him, beneath the decades of static and hum Naomi's, him breathes through the wire. Faint, but unmistakable. To some, it is proof of nothing. To others, proof of everything. The fire left no body. The records list no remains. But on that tape, two voices sing one mortal, one memory entwined across 50 years of silence. It ends as it began, a hiss, a hum, a sound that refuses to die. And somewhere within that sound, between the pulse of one breath and the ghost of another, the story of Naomi Greathouse lingers, half prayer, half promise. They called it testimony, but to those who've heard it, it feels more like inheritance. Vines crawl over the chapel like memory, reclaiming a secret. Kudzu drapes its bones, swallowing windows warped into glass waves. The wooden cross above the entrance leans, blackened not by flame, but by time. Field researchers move slowly through the tall grass, their footsteps pressing the past back into the dirt. Inside, dust floats like ash that never learned how to fall. They call it the Church of Silent Fire. There are no public records of its founding, no county deed, no congregation list filed with the state. Only a handful of oral accounts, half-remembered sermons whispered through generations. But in an attic near Moundville, inside a trunk marked Rev. Izaki McClendon, 1902, researchers found the first written trace, a pamphlet printed on rough pulp paper, browned and brittle. Its headline reads, "Fire is the only truth that lies." Beneath it, a line of smaller text, "The flame within cleanses without." At first glance, historians assumed metaphor. The language fit the theology of Emancipation-era spirituality, fire as purification, rebirth, the divine spark of deliverance. But when the research team entered the chapel in 1972, the metaphor began to feel less symbolic. The air inside carried a faint metallic scent. The wooden pews showed no scorch marks, yet the iron candle holders had melted, their stems sagging like wax. A metallurgical survey later confirmed the anomaly. Exposure to heat exceeding 900 degrees Celsius. No signs of combustion, no charred timber, no soot, just the quiet residue of something that burned without flame. Local historian Reverend Otis Childs described it as heat that forgets its source. In his field notes, he wrote, "The walls remember temperature, not trauma." But deeper in his notebook, a question appears in pencil. What kind of fire leaves glass alive? The church's bell still hangs, fused to its cradle. It bears a faint discoloration, an iridescent sheen like oil on water. When tapped, it no longer rings. It exhales a dull note, like breath against metal. Tests conducted at the University of Alabama dated its last exposure to intense heat between July 8th and July 14th, 1919, the same week Naomi Walker burned. Her name appears in the congregation ledger, recovered from a sealed jar beneath the chapel's floorboards. Next to it, in faded ink, her title, Founding Singer. Among 12 names, hers is the only one written twice, once in black, again in red. The red entry appears beside a later date, July 10th, 1919. The handwriting matches another known sample, Naomi's recipe book. The same looping end, the same careful pressure, the same faint tremor in the W. Dr. Fiona Mott, the linguist who analyzed the earlier hymnal references, described this as a moment where handwriting becomes liturgy. She proposed that Naomi's second signature may have been ritual rather than record a vow or offering. The Church of Silent Fire, she wrote, treated the act of inscription as invocation. To write one's name twice was to promise one's body to light. The pamphlet reinforces that theory. Its sermon fragment reads, "We do not wait for heaven's fire, we make room for it." Another line adds, "The skin remembers what the spirit must endure." When the researchers unearthed the church foundation, they found an object fused into the cornerstone, a silver spoon, warped, its handle curled into the stone like it had melted mid-breath. Engraved faintly on the back was a name, N. Walker. Under ultraviolet light, residues of carbon streak across the foundation stones in circular patterns, resembling burn halos. Yet the surrounding soil tested normal. No sign of electrical damage or fuel. Only evidence of extreme localized heat. The team's report ended with a single unresolved question. What burned here, if nothing burned? That question carried into a later documentary investigation. In footage recorded by anthropologist Sarah Kent, the camera lingers on the chapel's interior walls bowed inward, vines piercing through cracks, the air thick with dust. Her narration notes, "It's as though the building is breathing against us." Kent's microphone caught an anomaly, too, a faint harmonic vibration at the edge of hearing, similar to what was documented in the Great House recordings. Spectrographic analysis later confirmed the frequency aligned with the tonal range of the human voice, an E-flat sustained over several seconds. Locals avoid the place. Farmers call it the house that sweats. They say in midsummer, long after sundown, the windows glisten like they're melting again. One man recalled seeing what he described as a shimmer of air passing through the doorway, followed by a smell like burnt sugar. No one stays long enough to verify. The deeper researchers dug, the more the chapel seemed less a structure and more a residue of intention. Every object found, their brass hinges, candle cups, even fragments of nails registered molecular distortion, consistent with short-term heat bursts. Yet the surrounding wood remained intact. It was as though the fire had chosen what to touch. Historians reading through the church's few surviving sermons began to suspect its followers weren't waiting for redemption. They were rehearsing it, preparing for a moment when inner light might literally consume the flesh. One text, titled, "On the Silent Flame," warns, "When the body no longer shields, the soul begins to speak." That language mirrors accounts from other regional spiritual movements, Shaker-like trances, Pentecostal possession, but with one difference. Here, the fire was inward, not bestowed from above. It was something called forth. When compared to Naomi's final night, the parallels become chilling. Witnesses described her body surrounded by light, unburned, yet radiant. Clocks stopped, air stilled. She hummed the old hymn, the same hymn sung in this church, where fires seemed to rise from silence itself. Carbon dating does not tell stories, but it marks truth in ash. The bell's last transformation aligns precisely with Naomi's death. It's as if her departure echoed back through the faith that birthed Aten, aftershock of belief, manifesting in metal. One researcher wrote, "Either coincidence has a sense of ritual or ritual has a sense of time." Standing inside that chapel now, you can see your own breath even in summer. The walls are cold, though the air feels heavy. In the corner, beneath a veil of roots, lies the melted spoon. It glints when the light moves, as though something beneath still burns slowly. No one has tried to remove it. The stone around it resists every chisel, every blade. It remains fused an object half devoured, half offered. Some say it belonged to Naomi, others say it was the church's last communion piece, but the inscription, nearly erased, says enough. N. Walker, the name that sang, the fire that never left. And somewhere in the distance, through the static of history and the breath of heatless flame, the hymn still waits, low, patient, and eternal. The church of silent fire never burned down. It only forgot how to stop burning. The newspaper clipping fades into motion letters trembling like they're alive. Dr. Abel Ross, County Coroner. Missing since August 1920. The headline dissolves, leaving the typewriter text still echoing in the mind. A man once trusted. To certify the dead had himself vanished without a trace. Ross's disappearance came almost exactly 1 year after Naomi Walker's case. The town barely noticed. By then, Tuscaloosa had learned not to ask about the woman who could not burn. but his wife did. On August 11th, she filed a formal statement with the sheriff's office. Her words read almost like confession. He no longer sleeps. He speaks to the air as though she were in it. He says she hums when it rains. Neighbors recalled seeing Ross pacing his yard at night, holding something small, a vial, or maybe a matchbook, rolling it between his fingers. He'd look up at the sky before dawn and whisper, "Not yet." One farmhand swore he saw a faint light in the coroner's study long after midnight, like a candle burning inside a glass jar, but giving off no smoke. When the sheriff entered Ross's home a week after the report, the doctor's coat still hung on its peg. The study smelled faintly of kerosene. His typewriter sat mid-sentence, ribbon split. One key jammed on the letter R. The window was open, though it had rained that night, and drops of water streaked the papers into veins of gray. Inside a small drawer, investigators found a bundle of letters tied with blue thread. None were addressed. Each began the same way: "To whoever finds this before the fire does." The letters chronicled a mind unraveling or awakening. He described dreams where the air shimmered like hot metal, and a presence watching from the edge of the flame. He wrote, "I smell kerosene when it rains. I hear her humming." Yet there was precision in his words. No frantic scrawl, no break in grammar or thought. His sentences remained neat, clinical, as if he was documenting an illness, not suffering one. Modern analyst Dr. Ezra Fields, who examined the letters in 2003, confirmed that the handwriting matched Ross's verified autopsy notes, written under sound mental condition. He was lucid, Fields said, lucid and terrified. Among the letters lies one dated July 4th, 1920. Ross writes, "The ledger was no hoax. The marks were not grease. They were her fingerprints, but not her hands. I followed the spiral until it disappeared into itself." That spiral, first mentioned in Naomi's scorched ledger, returns again and again in Ross's notes. He calls it the map of inversion, something he claimed to see reflected in the corneal tissue of Naomi's eyes during examination. No copy of that report survives. The official coroner's file was expunged in 1921, coinciding with Ross's disappearance. His wife later told a journalist, "He said the body wasn't gone, it was folded." The remark was dismissed as grief, but tucked inside one envelope was a small graphite sketch, faint and hurried, a human figure bent backward into a ring of fire, yet untouched. Beneath it, Ross wrote a single line: "She taught me what a hollow flame can hold." 4 months after his disappearance, rumors spread that Ross had fled to New Orleans or Charleston, chasing spiritualists and mediums. But no travel records, no tickets, no sightings exist. Only the trail of his handwriting. In 1972, archivists, cataloging private collections from disbanded county offices, uncovered a trunk marked Ross medical records. Inside were fragments of his typewritten reports, some singed at the edges. One included the phrase, "temperature unmeasurable, cause of ignition internal." The rest of the sheet was burned away. A marginal note in pencil reads, "Ask about the hymn," the same phrase that had appeared in his original coroner's ledger before it vanished. Fields's analysis of the letters revealed something else, a progressive linguistic pattern. Each letter became less clinical, more rhythmic. Like liturgy? The final unsent draft reads almost like a sermon. "I have looked into the flame and found it hollow. There's room in there for all of us. I have seen her light turn backward and shine through the dark side of the soul. When it calls, it does not burn. It remembers. The letter ends abruptly, signed simply, "A. There's no evidence," he mailed it. But what followed decades later still unsettles archivists. In 1946, when Naomi's burned ledger was rediscovered beneath the floorboards of the Great House, it was sent to the Tuscaloosa County Archives for preservation. Staff documented the artifact, its curled pages, its spiral marks. During cataloging, an unsigned note slipped from between the back cover and spine. It read, "The spiral opens inward." Remember? Same phrasing, same pressure, same slant. Handwriting identical to Dr. Ross's letters. The archivist on duty, a man named Harold Dunn, verified it twice before refusing to handle the object again. He reported an acrid smell, faintly chemical, intensified by touch. When stored in a sealed box, the note left a slight circular discoloration on the folder beneath, shaped like a ring of evaporated liquid. Years later, Dunn admitted in an interview that he'd kept a copy of the note, tracing it by hand. "I don't know why," he said. "I just felt like if I let it vanish too, it'd take something with it." He paused before adding, "Sometimes, when I turn out the light in the records room, I hear that humming. It's not a song exactly. It's like the room's remembering something warm." Dr. Fields believes Ross's disappearance represents the psychological collapse of a man trapped between science and faith. But others, like historian Martha Lefevre, disagree. "Collapse implies failure," she wrote. "Ross didn't collapse. He crossed over into his hypothesis." In her essay, "The Coroner Who Followed the Fire," Lefevre points out an overlooked clue. Ross's property records show a single item purchased 2 months before his disappearance's small cast iron stove, never delivered. When traced to the vendor, the order sheet carried a faint handprint on the bottom corner. Analysis revealed high carbon content, as though from soot, yet the paper bore no damage. One theory claims Ross sought to recreate the event that it consumed. Naomi, too, witnessed the transformation firsthand. Another suggests he never intended to return from it. Whatever the truth, the man vanished without farewell. Only the letters remained, each growing quieter, more reverent, as if preparing for communion with something unseen. The sheriff closed the case in 1921. Presumed drowned. The report states, though no body, no clothing, no trace of him was ever found near the river. The last sighting, if it can be called, that came from a railway worker who claimed to see a figure walking the tracks south of town. The man wore a doctor's coat. The worker remembered a glow, faint but steady, trailing behind him like light. "Caught in fog. When pressed," he said, "it didn't look like fire. More like the air wanted to burn, but couldn't." Over a century later, Dr. Abel Ross exists only in fragments, his name in missing persons logs, his letters in sealed folders, his voice in nothing but paper. But the phrase he left behind continues to appear in margins, in ledgers, in field notes from those who study the case. There's room in there for all of us. Some read it as madness, others as faith. But one truth lingers. Every man who examined Naomi Walker tried to define what she became, and each, in their own way, followed her into the light. The last letter, still preserved in the county vault, carries faint residue across its edges. When held to flame, it doesn't ignite. The ink glows red, just for a moment, before cooling back to black. It's as if, even now, the handwriting remembers the hand that wrote it and the fire that never left him. The basement smelt of dust and cold concrete, a faint temps of mildew lingering in the air. Metal shelving groaned under the weight of Boxer's stamped Walker case. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a rhythm of shadows across the room. A security camera clicked on, its lens blinking red as if to mark the beginning of something it already knew. Archivist Lillian. Price first noticed the anomalies in 1985. She had spent weeks cataloging the Naomi Walker files, meticulously, noting dates, photographs, and handwritten letters. Then, one morning, a box she had sealed and labeled appeared on a different shelf. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been forced. Yet inside, the papers were subtly rearranged, pages shifted by increments too precise to be accidental. Price returned the boxes to their original placement, convinced she had overlooked something. The next week, the same sequence repeated. A photograph she had examined dozens of times now seemed different. In one glass plate negative from 1918, Naomi's kitchen window reflected two figures instead of one. At first, she suspected a double exposure during development, but laboratory inspection confirmed the negative had never been touched to Gelinio manipulation. The glass held its original emulsion, undisturbed for decades. The revelation drew the attention of photographic historian Alan Vance. He examined the image under magnification, considering every angle, every possible light source. Exposure layering, he theorized. But as he measured the angles of reflection, the calculations refused to align. The physics don't match, he admitted quietly. It's impossible for the second figure to appear where it does. Infrared scans offered another anomaly. Deep into the fibers of the paper, faint fingerprints appeared too intricate and deeply impressed to have been made by paper handlers. The thermal residue patterns mirrored a subtle heat bloom, as though the paper itself had absorbed energy from some transient source. The box, the photo, the ledger, they all carried traces of something ephemeral, a presence passing through matter without disturbing it. Price noticed that certain files seemed to hum when held close to the infrared scanner. A low vibration barely perceptible, yet consistent across multiple artifacts. She documented it, writing in her notes. Objects respond as if remembering Naomi. Colleagues questioned her observations. Instruments could not remember. And yet, the repeated anomalies refused to be dismissed. Vance continued research until 1993, working in his private studio with high-precision scanners and controlled light chambers. He became obsessive, tracking reflections, fingerprints, and thermal patterns across all known Walker artifacts. Then, late one evening, he reported an incident that would end his involvement. His own stove, a small model in his studio kitchen, turned itself on. The knob rotated, the burner ignited without touch. Vance checked circuits, fuses, safety, cutoffs, everything was normal. The time on the stove's display read 7:03. He claimed later in his notes that he could feel the heat bloom, not on the metal but in the air surrounding him. The sensation, he wrote, was like standing inside the residue of a long-extinguished flame. For after that night, Vance left the project entirely. He refused to speak of what he experienced in his studio. He took his negatives, notes, and instruments, and stored them in an off-site facility. Researchers attempting to retrieve the materials years later found the boxers rearranged again. Although the facility had not been entered, Price continued cataloging, but the basement grew difficult too. Work in. The lights would flicker, files would shift subtly overnight, and the faint vibration through certain folders persisted. She described the feeling in a journal entry, as if the room itself refuses closure. The archive breathes, and we are intruding. Among the most troubling items was a ledger page showing Naomi at the kitchen window, reflecting the second figure tall. Indistinct, yet undeniably human in shape. When examined under ultraviolet light, faint heat traces radiated outward, echoing the pattern found in Ross's letters and the Church of Silent Fire's bell. The fingerprints, thermal residues, and subtle displacements across decades suggested one continuous presence, or one that could traverse objects in time. Archivists debated whether to isolate the files entirely, fearing contamination or danger. But Price insisted on documenting everything. She recorded the anomalies meticulously. Angles of reflections, depth of fingerprints, thermal readings, unusual sounds captured on contact microphones placed in the boxers. The most mysterious aspect was consistency. Across decades, from Naomi's ledger to Rosa's unsent letters to the Walker case files, patterns repeated at intervals aligning with 703 time and presence synchronized in ways conventional physics could not explain. A graduate student, reviewing the archives in 1997, recounted that when she opened one box, the faint hum that Price had described became audible to her without equipment. She described it as a low, melodic vibration like a whispered hymn carried across a room's geometry. The note, the hum, the reflected figure, they all tied back to the moments Naomi had been observed in her final hours. Price concluded that the Walker archive was not inert. Each object responded to attention, to observation, perhaps even to memory. Attempts to isolate or control the collection only amplified the anomalies. Files returned on their own. Pages shifted. Photographs reflected impossible angles. Thermal residues appeared and disappeared as though the paper itself exhaled heat in response to unseen eyes. The final entry in Price's 1992 field notes reads, "We are no longer handling records. The archive handles us. Every observation, every measurement seems already anticipated, and always 703. By the time the basement was secured with modern locks and alarm systems, the collection had taken on a life of its own. Security footage shows boxers moving slightly after doors were closed. Shadows fall differently than expected. Cameras occasionally pick up a flicker of movement in the reflection of glass plate negatives, never matching the position of researchers. The archive refused to remain still. Even decades after Naomi Walker's disappearance, her presence through heat, reflection, and residual energy continued to assert itself. Each anomaly, each unexplained reflection, each faint vibration tied the living researchers to a past they could observe but never fully control. In the quiet moments, when the basement air stilled and the boxers seemed to breathe with their own rhythm, one truth remained undeniable. The Walker case was not merely a collection of documents and photographs. It was a continuation of the phenomena itself, an archive that would not stay closed. And at 703, every box, every page, every faint reflection aligns, as if time itself pauses to acknowledge her presence, silent, persistent, and alive in ways science cannot explain. The flame rippled like a heartbeat, captured in shaky 2002 documentary reenactment footage. It pulsed, expanding and contracting, each motion hypnotic, as if it were listening to a rhythm beyond sight or sound. The camera lingered on the stovetop, a shallow cast iron basin that had once contained the stew Naomi Walker prepared, now nothing but a vessel for memory and mystery. For decades, researchers approached the case through physics, plasma resonance, spontaneous combustion, heat curves of stoves, insulation anomalies. All were tested, measured, and charted, but none explained the simplest, most unsettling fact. Naomi's body had remained unburned. No carbonization, no charring, no trace beyond the ephemeral heat. She had disappeared from the fire, leaving only its echo, Dr. Mira Hahn, an acoustic physicist, was the first to suggest an unconventional approach. She hypothesized that sound frequencies might interact with matter in ways previously undocumented, that the hum of a human voice could act as a catalyst under the right conditions. Using a preserved ledger and a rare recording of Naomi's hymn, she designed an experiment to replicate the kitchen's conditions from July 3, 1919, when the hymn played at a precise 432 Hz. The thermocouples recorded a heat curve matching that of the original stove. Iron, enamel, and surrounding air heated exactly as Naomi had described in her ledger. Yet no flame appeared, no combustion occurred beyond the meter readings. The sound seemed to carry energy into matter itself, a resonance that could stir heat from nowhere. Hahn's notes describe it with a quiet reverence. I have watched matter respond to music. Not metaphorically. It obeys. It pulses. At 7:03, the flame sang back. Colleagues were skeptical. The grant supporting her research was quietly revoked. Conferences avoided the topic. Journal submissions returned with vague editor notes about methodological error or inappropriate conjecture. Yet Hahn continued her recordings in private, documenting every anomaly, every heat spike, every subtle vibration. She charted sound waves, capturing the interplay between frequency and thermal response, all pointing to the same phenomenon. The fire itself resonated, as if alive and conscious. The diary entries she kept reveal a gradual transformation in her perception. Initially, she described instruments, tables, and calculations. Weeks later, she wrote in the first person, "The flame answers me. I ask for warmth. It bends to my voice. I sing the hymn at 432 Hz. It hums." During the experiment, she noted a particularly striking observation. The moment the melody reached its climax, the thermocouple nearest the stove glowed an intense orange, then dimmed to normal temperature immediately after. No physical flame, no residue. Yet the heat pattern mirrored the one recorded in 1919. Hahn called it a thermal echo, a phenomenon that obeyed rhythm and intonation. Audio recordings of the experiment exist, though attempts to preserve them online yield only silence. The waveform appears flat. Yet, in the laboratory, playing the file through calibrated equipment produces measurable thermal activity, vibrations in air and metal. It is as if the memory of the sound is embedded in matter itself, untranslatable by conventional recording devices. Hahn's colleagues, observing remotely, reported a subtle tremor in the lab air, moving without a fan. Shadows lengthening, lights flickering in sync with the playback. Some described an olfactory cue, a faint burnt scent that never corresponded to any heat source. The effect lasted seconds but lingered in perception, leaving the observer unsure whether it was physical or psychological. Further experiments explored different frequencies and tempos. Only the 432 Hz arrangement of Naomi's hymn produced the precise thermal signature. Changing tempo, key, or voice eliminated the phenomenon entirely. It suggested a highly specific resonance between sound, time, and matter, one that could not be reproduced by accident. Hahn documented her results meticulously, noting correlation with prior events. The flame, she argued, was less a chemical reaction than a response to structured energy and echo of Naomi's presence, carried across time through her voice and the hymn's cadence. It was a communication through matter, using heat as language. Her final diary entry is haunting. Tonight, at 7:03, the stove rippled as though breathing. I whispered the hymn. It answered. The flame spoke, and I understood, briefly, what it means to leave without leaving. The implications were profound. If sound could catalyze matter in this way, historical accounts of Naomi's fire might not be anomalies, but testimonies of interaction between consciousness, sound, and energy. Physics alone could not explain it. Chemistry could not explain it. The act of humming, the precise intonation, and the timing all were necessary components. Attempts to present her findings formally were met with resistance. Universities flagged the work as too speculative. Grants disappeared. In private, Han continued her research, using small reproductions of the stove, soundproof chambers, and isolated recordings. Every replication of the event hinted at the same truth. The fire itself contained memory and agency, responding only to its own harmonic key. The microhook of the experiment remains unsolved. Digital archives cannot capture the event. Uploading the files produces silence. Listening without the precise laboratory context yields nothing. Only through careful reconstruction, replication of ambient conditions, and exact frequency can one observe the phenomenon. It exists at the edge of perception, real, yet intangible. When later researchers attempted to replicate Han's work, they described a feeling of presence in the lab, a weightless awareness, neither threatening nor benign, but insistent. The flame, though invisible, seemed to acknowledge human intent. Instruments reacted. Shadows pulsed. The hum of matter itself could be heard faintly, imperceptible but measurable. The legacy of Han's work is a testament to the intersection of human observation, sound, and the unknown. She called the flame a living record of Naomi's existence, a medium that remembered her, him, and her intent, pulsing across time to touch those attuned to it. The chapter closes on the 2002 footage once more. The flame ripples, heartbeat-like, expanding, contracting, as if inhaling the room. No one can say whether it is fire, memory, or something else entirely. In that heartbeat, the voice of Naomi persists, humming at 432 Hz, unburned, unheard by most. Yet speaking to those who listen, it is a fire that speaks, and it waits at 7:03. The drone hovered above Alabama's dense woods, shafts of golden sunlight cutting through the early morning fog. Each tree cast a long, trembling shadow, and the wind whispered across leaves like a hesitant sigh. Below, the earth held secrets of a century, buried deep beneath roots and soil, waiting to be found. A new homeowner, clearing the edge of a forgotten field, uncovered fragments of the old great house stove. Rusted and blackened, the iron pieces seemed ordinary at first, but when polished, they emitted a faint warmth, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat trapped in metal. Touching them was disorienting. The fragments seemed to hum under fingertips, carrying a memory, not just of heat, but of presence. Thermal imaging, brought in by a curious physicist friend, revealed something extraordinary. The stove fragments registered a residual temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, exactly human body heat. No external source could account for it. The warmth seemed constant, decaying imperceptibly over decades, as though the heat itself remembered the form it had once inhabited. Speculation emerged almost immediately. Theorists proposed Naomi Walker had achieved what they called self-transference combustion, a conscious merging of human energy in flame. Philosophers dismissed it as metaphor, a poetic rendering of death. Believers described it as deliverance, a passage through fire that left nothing behind but essence. Skeptics muttered about oxidation and chemical retention of heat, but the readings persisted, empirical and undeniable. The fragments were carefully measured, scanned, and compared. Each retained warmth in isolation. When placed together, the heat intensified, almost as if they recognized one another. The air above the pieces shimmered faintly, visible only under high-definition infrared imaging. The effect was subtle, yet undeniable. A body's energy, transmuted and enduring, lingering in the object itself. Among the most haunting discoveries was the final page of Naomi's ledger, recovered from the burned house decades prior. The handwriting trembled, fragile and wavering, yet unmistakably hers. If fire is punishment, why does it sing so sweet? The words were both a question and a revelation, capturing the paradox of her disappearance. Fire, the element that devours, had instead preserved her, transformed her, and carried her essence beyond conventional understanding. Historians and physicists debated the implication. Was Naomi's disappearance a literal transference, a merging with energy? Or was it a metaphor that had taken tangible form through thermal memory and material resonance? The line between science and miracle blurred. Every touch of iron, every measured degree of warmth, insisted that something beyond ordinary understanding had occurred. The emotional resonance was inescapable. For decades, those who studied her case wrestled with fear, awe, and wonder. Naomi's act was intimate, private, and defiant a refusal to be reduced to ashes or records. She left heat where people expected cold remains, leaving behind an absence that felt like presence. In every experiment, in every measurement, she persisted. Philosophers speculated about the nature of consciousness and matter. Could a human will fuse with energy so completely that the body became a medium of its own memory? Believers argued Naomi had transcended corporeal limitations, choosing the form of her liberation. Skeptics were left with fragments of metal, faint warmth, and unanswerable questions. Field researchers recorded thermal readings each July, comparing the fragments against ambient temperatures. Each year, the readings peaked near the same time, subtle, fleeting, almost imperceptible. The resonance was cyclical, tied to a date, a memory encoded in matter, as though time itself honored her act. And yet, it was not only a scientific phenomenon. For those who engaged with the story emotionally, the fragments carried the echo of a person, her voice humming in the kitchen, her eyes reflecting candlelight, her presence in a moment of luminous stillness. The warmth was human, not just thermal. It was Naomi, in some enduring form, reminding the living of what it meant to exist fully, courageously, and mysteriously. The final reflection, recorded in a voiceover for the emerging documentary, captures the weight of understanding and awe. Perhaps Naomi didn't burn to death. Perhaps she burned away everything that wasn't alive. It is a notion that transcends evidence and enters myth, a woman choosing a form beyond ordinary comprehension, leaving the trace of warmth in the world as proof she had been there, and still was, and somewhere, each July 3rd, at precisely 7:03 p.m., kitchen lights flicker across Alabama homes. No one sees a figure, hears a voice, or understands why the flame dances for a moment. But those who know the story feel a presence, a pulse of warmth, a memory encoded in energy itself. A name remembered. Naomi Walker, the woman who became heat, the flame that sang, endures. Her legacy is not in ashes or in fear, but in the quiet warmth that refuses to die. The persistent resonance that bridges past and present, matter and memory, fire and human will. Her act, inscrutable, yet undeniable, is a testament to transformation, the kind that leaves behind no body, no record, only an essence, palpable and eternal. In that light, the forest drifts beneath the drone, the fog moving like breath, and the fragments under the soil glow faintly, whispering their memory back to the world. Heat becomes history. Memory becomes presence. And Naomi Walker exists, still, in every warmth that cannot be explained, in every flicker at 7:03, across a century she never left.